Hey guys, this is your unit lecture for Unit 3. This is the final unit in our course, Early American Lit. This unit covers the years of American literature between 1820 and 1865. Our introduction kind of backs up a little bit all the way to 1790 and discusses some early 20th century like interwoven connections between our literature that we're really primarily focusing on, and how we were thinking about that in the early 20th century. But for the most part, the years we're focusing on are 1820 to 1865. And like the last unit, well, I guess technically our first unit, these slides I created myself based on the information found in the Norton Anthology in our textbook. I will base the quiz out of everything directly from the book, and there may be questions on the quiz that I don't cover in this lecture. I cover kind of the big ideas and the things that I think you need to know going into reading American Lit for just the last part of our course, but I might not cover all the questions on the quiz. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is not a foolproof way to take the quiz. Definitely read the chapter introduction. And also, with that being said, I felt like this was a very quick read. It was a very short introduction. I don't think it was as long as most of the Norton Anthology introductions for any of their texts, early, late American Lit, British Lit, any of it. So I found this one to be the easiest to read. And I also found it to be very, they used a lot of examples to back up the main claims that they were making. So it's quick. So a lot of the, content and chunks of paragraphs are just a bunch of examples to support an idea. So I found that easy to read as well. Okay, so our textbook breaks up the introduction into 5 different sections. And the first section is an American Renaissance. Specifically, they put a question mark in parentheses next to the word Renaissance. So we'll talk about that. And I think that really what this section of our introduction is getting at is that it's hard to say if we have a Renaissance, but the reason that we wanted to deem it a Renaissance, or I guess scholars wanted to deem it a Renaissance, was to give it a little bit more weight. Okay, so if you think about British literature, you have a big focus, when we talk about Renaissance lit, there's a huge focus on sort of just how literature changed during the Renaissance, and how art changed during the Renaissance, and just how much Renaissance there was, and Reformation and change. And so the question here is, can we call it a Renaissance? I mean, scholars want to call it a Renaissance because that suggests a change, a weightiness, an importance, and that's what the text is really kind of explaining, is that to create a national literature, you have to give your readers something to want to read, right? A reason to read that goes beyond just wow, look at America, there's this new country, and let's read what they're doing, but more something more important, something more literary. And our book is saying, okay, so scholars called it a Renaissance to give it that importance, but was it really a Renaissance? Maybe not. So in the early 20th century, and again, this is outside the scope of the literature that we're looking at, but it wasn't until the 1940s that American Lit was as highly regarded as British Lit. So if you think about, our time frame, 1820 to 1865, the works that were being published, it's not necessarily like they were published and instantly everyone was buying them. Or if they were being instantly purchased, it wasn't as if they were being published and instantly scholars and thinkers and philosophers were really digging into the text across the world. That didn't happen until the early 20th century in terms of just thinking about American Lit as as worthwhile and as beneficial as British lit, because, British lit has been around since, I can't necessarily say forever, but for a really, really long time, much longer, since, before we had modern English. So in the early to mid 20th century, scholars started to think of American authors who published in our time period as cultivating a renaissance of American writing. So kind of like this change, right? We're definitely in well into a couple of decades post Revolutionary War, post America founding itself as a country. And so a lot of this kind of scholarship and thinking about the time period that we're looking at regarding literature is what led the texts that we're looking at to be included in the canon of lit, or like what we decide to read. In some cases, and our book tells us that, there are a couple of examples where we don't even necessarily have 1850s to 1865 publications of texts. We have the republication of the text from the early 20th century or late 19th century. And so what that tells us is, again, maybe a text, when it was first written by one of our authors, when it first came out, maybe it was published somewhere, but it didn't get a ton of attention until scholars and critics started going back and re-looking at the work and rediscovering the texts of this time period. And so our textbook is kind of asking this question, well, is it a renaissance because what came before it was literature before the nation was formed. So how can we have a renaissance of American lit if we didn't actually have American lit? And this kind of speaks to like all around the different readings that we've read so far. Native American writings, or writings from people who were enslaved and brought over from Africa, all sorts of individuals coming from different religious backgrounds and different thinking. And so we didn't necessarily have an American national literature. We had what we call American lit, but now we have, this kind of 1820 period and on. And again, our book kind of considers like the late 18th century, 1790s and such, as also part of that more nationalistic American lit. So that's what the question mark is there for. There wasn't necessarily a before for there to be an after in the process of a renaissance. One of the other things that our textbook talks about in this section is like what was included in canon, in the canon of this time period in American literature, is kind of started to be rethunk. Can I say that? We're rethinking it, and I think we've been rethinking it for a little bit of time, and even more so, I think every edition of Norton Anthologies include more diverse voices. And so specifically the canon, in the early 20th century, in the 1940s, was not taking into consideration, I think, enough African American lit and not enough women's lit. And now, we're starting to add that. But you can take a class in college today on African American lit and women's lit, and you certainly couldn't do that in 1940. Okay, another section of our textbook is American literary nationalism in the 1820s. And so what has influenced national American lit is kind of two ideals, or two ideas. One is the myth of the Republican hero, and so this is the concept of I don't think our textbook means Republican in the sense that we think of it today, like Republican and Democrat, although we see both of those words here in what has influenced American lit. But in this case, the myth of the Republican hero really refers to like the underdog coming to America, defeating, the monarchy and the crown, and am I saying that too contemporarily? Defeating the king, and building a nation. That's the myth of the Republican hero. And our book says that's really hard to get over. And I think if I'm speaking outside of our textbook, I would say it's still really hard to get over, even outside of, what are we, 200 years after the 1820s. And so the other thing that's influenced National American Lit is the Jacksonian democratic ideals. And these are, I think we still see both of these today. The concept that the common man has rights, and we need to give more rights to the individual. People are equal, and all people deserve rights, and there's not one body who can take away someone else's rights, specifically thinking about the government, the church, but even more curiously, as literature of the time period is written, thinking about how people in the United States of America are fully supporting these Jacksonian democratic ideals while also practicing the complete opposite of that. Of course, we can think about the genocide of Native Americans, and then also slavery. So the texts will think about that. We will see texts that appreciate these myths and these ideals, and we will also see texts that question them and ask about, are we truly upholding these myths and these ideals in the way that we would like to. The other thing that I think is important that the text stresses here and at the end is that the American Lit doesn't just exist in America. It's not just a literature that's influenced by what's happening in America. It is seen as being in conversation with English Lit, British Lit, literature that's, outside of the United States. In fact, later on we'll talk about this again, but some of our authors are reading, or Lit from South America. And so while this literature is being used to form American nationalism, it's also kind of grabbing influences from all over the world. Key explorations of American Lit, and again, this goes back to 1790, future of the nation, what's going to happen, we're a brand new nation, who are we going to be, where are we going to be, who should we be, questions like that. Strengths and weaknesses of the nation, like what's going on, what are we doing well, what are we doing not so well. Critiques, you'll see a lot of critique in this time period, in the writing of this time period. A lot of the authors that we're going to be looking at had major critiques of what was going on. And a lot of, I like to think of it as, our book certainly does not make this connection, but something that I like to think of it as is social media. And I'm not trying to equate literary works of, wonderful literary works with a tweet. But the concept that people are thinking about the nation in a new way, and tons of content is being published, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But there are plenty of voices who are critiquing what's going on in the world, and specifically in the small world. And so I think that if we think of it like that, in this just explosion of voices, I see some similarities, and so then we have to, kind of question, well, whose voice is going to stay around the longest? And again, that gets you back to what's included in the canon. Some other key explorations of American Lit include the nation's character and potential. And our authors are interested and also skeptical of all of these things. What does it mean? Have we built the perfect country? Obviously not. Another section of our text, and it's I think I've kind of touched on this already, but talks about the literary marketplace in an expanding nation. So kind of in the beginning, nobody was really wanting to buy American lit. And like I said before, when texts were published initially, eventually a lot of people read certain authors, but not all authors were read a lot of the time. So some developments did aid to the growth in publishing, which you'll see gets the word out for more authors. So technological developments, now I'm not talking about the printing press, we've already talked about that, that was like 1400s, but other technological developments increased urbanization, so more people in the same space talking about writing, more transportation networks, canals, trains, connections between cities is going to get words around more quickly, and so ideas are moving around more quickly. If a magazine is published, it's easier to get that magazine up to New York, or I guess probably from New York down to other cities, and then an increasing population and a diverse increasing population. And much of this led to a dramatic growth of newspaper and magazine publishing. And so a lot of what we'll read are essays that are published in newspapers or magazines, as opposed to novels, although novels, certainly as we have experienced, there were plenty of those. Women even began publishing more heavily and more significantly, which is, I'd say, always a good thing. Then we have our second to last section. This is probably the longest section of our textbook, and it uses tons of examples to really kind of prove the points that it's trying to make. It's titled Renaissance, Reform, Conflict. So one of the words that gets tossed around a lot in this part of our text in the introduction is antebellum, and I've been listening to a book mostly unrelated to the time period that we're in, however, reflecting on it, I guess. And I never really thought about the word. Like, I think I understood what it meant in theory, but I didn't know the exact definition. And just specifically, in general, thinking outside of the context of any country, it's, something before a war. But specifically, if we think about antebellum in the United States, it's that pre-Civil War period of U.S. history. And I think that, like, a lot of, I feel like in my head, at the very least, I'm thinking of some, like, country music or something where you can maybe visualize that pre-Civil War period where we've possibly glorified it, depending on where you're from, actually, probably. I think there are places in the South that have kind of glorified it, and I'm not a pre-Civil War scholar, so I don't necessarily know how accurate that glorification would be, but it's interesting to kind of think about and thinking about the context of these writings. So this antebellum literature led to a number of reforms, and I put reforms here in quotation marks because I don't think that we want to think about them in terms of, like, policies to make a change, but more so a change in thinking, and change in national thinking, a change in the thinking of, the common person. So science and technology developments to make the world better. I put world in question there because it might just be the United States. Our book wasn't exactly clear on that. Anti and pro-slavery reforms. And so here I think we're thinking of, if the Declaration was set to give states right, to put, a lot of rights on the person and on the state, at the state level, and, not have such a weighty and overpowering government. There's reform in terms of anti-slavery, of course, but there was also thinking of pro-slavery reform, like states or plantation owners who wanted, of course, to continue slavery, and how can we reform it so that we can still do that. There's this writing led to Protestant evangelical reform, women's reforms in terms of, women writing for and requesting, at times demanding, their place in education, the ability to vote, even reforms on temperance, probably what leads to prohibition, although I'm sure that there are a lot of factors that led to prohibition, which is outside of our scope as well. I had to look up temperance, although I figured it was abstaining from alcohol, but I've never necessarily used that word. Not drinking. And then, of course, reforms covering like the near genocide of Native Americans. Some reform style writings, some questioning of that, some calling it out, but on a much smaller scale than what we're going to see with anti-slavery writing. And again, this is one of the biggest sections of the introduction, but most of it is exemplary in nature. And then finally we get to the small and large world of American writers. And our book has this quote. I'm going to read two quotes actually, but our book has this quote, I believe on page 506, maybe 505. The authors in this anthology often were in conversation with one another. Their world was relatively small, and the number of instances of direct and indirect influences, counter-influences, productive friendships, productive rejections of influences and friendships, and so on are stunning. And really what the text means here is that American literature does not just exist in this bubble all by itself, and the writers of American lit don't just exist in this bubble all by themselves. They are reading each other's works. So American authors are reading other American authors. They are reading, again, like I said before, they're reading authors from other countries, Southern American writings, they're reading European literature. They are reading texts from the past. So our American authors are, reading things that were published just before the 1820s. They're reading things that we have read in this class, but they're also reading things as far back as, ancient Greek writings, things that you would maybe have read in high school or something like that. Definitely, Shakespeare and the Iliad, the Odyssey, like all of those great texts. So they're not by themselves. In fact, one of the things that I remember learning about like Emerson and Thoreau, and I believe there was a woman involved in there. It's possible that it was Margaret Fuller, but that they like existed in this community of writers, and they like hung out with each other, and they thought about each other's works, and they read each other's works, and they read other people who we are reading, and so they're not existing independently of one another, and I think that if we had any claim to say that writing can, cause change and create a difference, I think part of the reason that might be the case is that writers don't just publish something and walk away. They exist in a conversation, a constant conversation, and I think that is probably how we get steps of change. The other thing I'll read is, and I didn't have room on this slide, is the second to last sentence on page 507. It's the second to last sentence of the entire introduction, and it says, "The point that should be emphasized at the close of this introduction is that the diverse writings published circa 1820 to 65 continue to remain foundational to the study of American literature, not only because of what they accomplished within their own moment, but also because, as Whitman says about himself, they ultimately cannot be contained within that moment and even within a national frame." And so what our textbook is saying is that the American lit that we are getting ready to study is something that, we don't just study it because this is a survey course and we want to study early American lit. We study it because these are the texts that we go back to. And the reason these are the texts that we go back to is because these are the writers that went back to the texts that they went back to. There's just this interconnected, woven idea of thinking, of conversation, like I said before, and they are creating written thought based on the past, based on a global worldview, at least as far as they could conceive. And we go back to these texts because that's the goal, right? We also want to do that. So they're extremely influential, and that's why they're in the canon. Now, does that suggest that there aren't other things that could be in the canon that aren't? No, certainly not. But these are those. So that concludes my introduction. If you guys have any questions or you want to talk more about anything that I've talked about here, just let me know. Otherwise, I hope you all are doing well.